Hello, I'm Francis Collins. I'm a physician scientist, and I've had the privilege of leading the Human Genome Project. I'm also a believer in God. It is my privilege to serve as a host for this course and to begin the course with an introduction to some of the topics that we'll be talking about from my own perspective as someone who's studied DNA, the instruction book for all life, but who also is a follower of Jesus Christ. Robert Jastrow, the noted astronomer, wrote a book of his own called God and the Astronomers, and his opening lines were rather memorable. He said, when a scientist writes about God, his colleagues assume that he's either going bonkers or over the hill. Well, I hope I am neither. And in fact, I'm not such an oddball. Some 40% of working scientists also believe in a God to whom one may pray in expectation of an answer. And that hasn't changed very much over the last 100 years. Many people are surprised by that because scientists don't often talk about their own personal faith. Well, I'm going to talk about it a little bit here as part of this introduction. Around us, we see many shrill voices that are arguing that science and faith are incompatible, that you have to make a choice between a scientific worldview, which basically uses the tools of science to investigate nature and says that that's all there is, and a spiritual worldview, which explores other types of questions like why are we all here anyway, questions that science is not well suited to address. It is my perspective that those worldviews are not incompatible, and that in fact, a thoughtful person can incorporate both of those perspectives as they go through life. And yet that seems increasingly to be a well-kept secret. So here in this next few minutes, I'd like to go through my own pathway of how it is that I became both a scientist and a believer, and how I see those worldviews as being entirely complementary and reinforcing each other rather than being at war. As the leader of the Human Genome Project, I've had the incredible privilege of leading a team of thousands of scientists around the world to read out all the letters of the Human DNA Instruction Book. DNA is the information molecule of life. This is a model of it, the wonderful double helix that you've heard much about. And inside this double helix, each of the rungs of the ladder, if you will, of this twisted structure, is the way in which DNA carries information. Each rung has one of 4 possibilities. So it's a simple language with just 4 letters in its alphabet, and yet it is the way that all living things carry information and pass that on from one generation to the next. Our own DNA instruction book, all of these letters lined up end to end, is 3 billion of those, which is a pretty amazingly large amount of information when you think about the fact that you have that inside each cell of your body. If we decided that we were going to read that, just because it would be interesting, and we read it at a usual pace of A, C, G, A, C, T, T, and so on, it would take us all about 31 years to get through the script, even if we kept at it 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. An amazing concept that we have all that information that we pass from parent to child down through the ages. Your DNA and mine are 99.9% the same, which is to say we're all part of one big worldwide family. The study of the genome now puts us in a position to be able to make the kinds of medical breakthroughs for diabetes and heart disease and cancer and many other conditions that people had only dreamed of until recently. And so a real revolution in medicine is likely to happen in the next 15 to 20 years. And for me as a physician scientist, this is a very exciting time. And yet, my own search for the truth is not limited to the scientific method. I'm also a man of faith. How did that come about, you might ask? And many would assume, I suppose, that I must have been raised in a household where faith was practiced, and I made it my own and have carried it with me for my entire life. But that's not really my story. The home in which I grew up was not disdainful of faith, but it didn't seem very relevant. And when I got to college, I became an agnostic, and then I went to graduate school studying physics and chemistry, and I became convinced that everything that mattered could be described with mathematics and physics, and there was no need for anything further. And I became an atheist, and I was not very tolerant of people who expressed any interest in spiritual matters. But then I had a change of heart in terms of what I wanted to do professionally, and decided that the study of life might be an even more exciting one than the study of atoms and molecules, and I went to medical school. And there my atheism encountered the realities of suffering and death in a way that I hadn't previously experienced. This was no longer hypothetical. I was surrounded by people who were facing really terrible challenges from illness. And many of them seemed to lean on their faith in a very puzzling way, giving them strength and courage, and they expressed no fear of what lay beyond. And that puzzled me, and one of my patients one day asked me, "So, doctor, what do you believe?" And I realized as I tried to stammer out an answer that I wasn't really sure, that my atheism had been grounded not upon a careful consideration of the evidence, but just upon a general sense that thinking people didn't really need that anymore, that spiritual stuff. And determined then to go and shore up my atheism by studying it more in a specific way, I began reading more about what the principles of faith were. I encountered the writings of C.S. Lewis, the Oxford scholar who had been an atheist himself and set about to shore up his atheism, only to his surprise, becoming a convert. And in the first few pages of his book, Mere Christianity, I realized that all of my arguments against the plausibility of faith essentially lay in ruins. They were the arguments of a schoolboy. Shaken up by that, but determined to follow this wherever it would take me, I eventually came to the conclusion that there was more evidence in favor of the existence of God than there was that disfavored it. And I realized that I was being called in a certain way to make a decision based upon those realizations. I studied the face of the world, and ultimately I encountered this remarkable person, the person of Jesus Christ, who not only claimed to know God, but to be God. And that seemed to require a decision. And so, even as I was pursuing medicine, I was also pursuing God's truth. And on a beautiful day in the Cascade Mountains, hiking, was surrounded by the beauty of nature, and with my mind cleared of the many distractions that so often clutter up our thought processes, I realized that I could no longer resist. And I gave my life to Christ that afternoon. Well, you might say, isn't that a problem? You're a scientist and you're a believer and you work in genetics. Doesn't your head explode? Well, actually it doesn't. But many people have assumed that there's a conflict here, and I want to talk about that very explicitly. And of course, the battleground that many people perceive is this matter of evolution. The evidence in favor of evolution is actually overwhelming from a scientific perspective. As someone who studies DNA as part of my everyday professional life, DNA provides the kind of digital evidence for the relatedness of living things that had not previously been available. And much of that evidence has come along very recently. So how does one put this together? How do I, as a scientist and a believer, both see the grandeur of life's diversity, both study this remarkable molecule of DNA with all of its digital elegance, and also worship God Almighty as the Creator? I have no difficulties, actually, in putting those together at all. And I think most working scientists who are believers have arrived at the same synthesis. And it goes like this. If God Almighty, having a purpose for creating the universe and populating it with special creatures in His image, with whom He could have fellowship, in whom He could imbue an immortal soul, a knowledge of right and wrong, and free will, chose to use the mechanism of evolution to carry out that creative process, who are we to say that's not the way we would have done it? It's an incredibly elegant means of creating not just us, but all of the other wonderful creatures we see around us on this planet.